The cabin sat like a forgotten gravestone on Widow's Peak, 3 miles up a dirt road that barely deserved the name. Jake Morrison had hiked here every summer as a kid, but that was before Grandpa Ed disappeared 5 years ago, leaving nothing but questions and this rotting shack filled with what everyone called junk. Now 16 and holding the rusty key, Jake pushed through cobwebs and mouse droppings, ready to clear out decades of accumulated trash. Old newspapers, broken furniture, mason jars filled with mysterious liquids. It all had to go. But when he moved the heavy oak desk, something metallic clinked beneath the floorboards. What Jake found in that hidden compartment changed everything he thought he knew about the gentle old man who taught him to fish and whittle. FBI case files, fake passports, bundles of cash, and photographs that proved his grandfather wasn't Edward Morrison at all. He was Vincent the Ghost Castellano, a master thief who'd vanished with $12 million in stolen diamonds 40 years ago. The diamonds were still missing, and now someone else was coming for them. But who was watching Jake from the tree line? And how did they know he'd found the truth? Jake's hands trembled as he held the black and white photograph. The face staring back at him was unmistakably Grandpa Ed, but younger, wearing an expensive suit instead of flannel shirts. The FBI file bore a different name entirely, Vincent Castellano, wanted for armed robbery, grand theft, and conspiracy. The date stamped on the corner made Jake's stomach lurch. 1983, the same year his grandfather had supposedly moved to their small mountain town to start fresh. The hidden compartment was barely 3 feet square, carved out beneath what had once been solid floorboards. Inside, manila folders were stacked with military precision. Jake pulled out another file, this one containing blueprints of museums, banks, and jewelry stores scattered across 3 states. Red ink marked entry points, security camera angles, and escape routes in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. A sound outside made Jake freeze. The autumn wind had been rattling the cabin's loose shutters all afternoon, but this was different. The deliberate crack of a branch underfoot. He quickly stuffed the files back into the compartment and eased toward the grimy window. Through the streaked glass, he could make out a figure moving between the pine trees about 50 yards down the slope. Whoever it was wore dark clothing and moved with purpose, not like a lost hiker. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears as he watched the figure pause and seem to study the cabin. Jake ducked below the windowsill and crawled back to the hole in the floor. His mind raced as he grabbed one of the fake passports, flipping through pages stamped with entry dates from countries he'd never heard his grandfather mention. Edward Morrison, Frank Delacroix, Michael Torres, all bearing the same face with slight variations in hair color and facial hair. At the bottom of the compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth, Jake found something that made his blood run cold. A leather journal filled with his grandfather's careful script, documenting what appeared to be 40 years of life on the run. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks before his disappearance. They're getting close. The Torino family never forgets, and they never forgive. The diamonds are safe, but Jake and his mother can't know the truth. If something happens to me, I pray they stay hidden forever. Some secrets should die with the man who made them. Jake's vision blurred. The Torino family. He'd heard that name before, whispered in true crime documentaries about organized crime in the 1980s. His gentle grandfather, who'd made him pancakes every Sunday morning and taught him to identify bird calls, had stolen from the mob. Another sound from outside, closer this time. Jake peered through a gap in the shutters and felt his blood freeze. The figure was now only 20 yards away, and Jake could make out more details. A woman, maybe in her 40s, with sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to look right through the cabin walls. She carried something in her right hand that glinted in the dying afternoon light. Jake's phone had no signal up here. It never did. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the mountain, and his mother thought he was just cleaning out old furniture for a few hours. No one would come looking until dark. He grabbed the journal and one of the fake passports, shoving them into his jacket pocket. The rest of the evidence went back into the compartment, and he carefully repositioned the loose floorboards. His grandfather had kept these secrets hidden for decades. Jake could only hope he'd done enough to keep them that way. The front door creaked. Jake hadn't heard it open, which meant someone had entered very quietly. Professional quiet. His only chance was the back window, but that would mean crossing directly in front of the main room where footsteps now echoed softly against the wooden floor. The rusty key turned with surprising ease, and the cabin door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the surrounding pines. Jake stepped inside, immediately hit by the musty smell of decades-old dust and something else he couldn't quite identify, a metallic scent that made his nose wrinkle. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, illuminating dancing particles in the stale air. The interior was sparse but tidy, as if Grandpa Joe had simply walked out one day and never returned. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. Mismatched furniture sat arranged around a braided rug that had seen better days, and bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes whose titles Jake couldn't make out from the doorway. The kitchen was tiny but functional, with a wood-burning stove and a hand pump over a deep sink. Jake worked the handle experimentally and was surprised when clear water gushed out after a few strokes. At least the well still worked. He cupped his hands and took a tentative sip. It tasted clean and cold, better than the bottled water he'd brought. A narrow staircase led to what he assumed was a loft bedroom, but Jake decided to explore the main floor first. The bathroom was primitive but clean, and a small bedroom off the main room contained nothing but a bare mattress on a simple frame and an empty dresser. Jake was beginning to think his parents had been right about there being nothing of value here when he noticed something odd about the bookshelf in the main room. While most of the shelves were packed with books, one section at eye level held only a few scattered volumes, creating an obvious gap. He approached for a closer look. As he slid the book back into place, his fingers brushed against something that didn't feel like wood, a small metal lever, painted to blend in with the shelf but distinctly different in texture. Jake's heart rate quickened as he pressed it. Nothing happened at first. Then he heard a soft click. The entire bookshelf section swung inward like a door, revealing a dark space beyond. Jake's mouth went dry. A hidden room. In his grandfather's cabin. This was like something out of a movie, but it was the wall to his right that made him freeze in place. Dozens of newspaper clippings were tacked up, along with handwritten notes connected by red string, like something from a detective's evidence board. Even in the dim light from his phone, Jake could make out headlines: Bank robbery nets $2.30 million, FBI seeks armed suspects, heist crew still at large. The man in the center of the image, caught in profile as he walked down a street, was unmistakably his grandfather. Younger, with darker hair and a leaner face, but definitely Grandpa Joe, and written on the back in faded ink, Chicago, 1973. First national job. Jake's legs felt weak. He sank into the chair at the desk, staring at the photograph. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His grandfather, the man who had taught him to fish, who had slipped him extra allowance money, who had made the world's best pancakes, had apparently been involved in bank robberies. Metallic smell was stronger in here, and Jake suddenly realized what it was. Gun oil. His eyes swept the room again, noticing details he'd missed before: a gun safe in the corner, maps with routes marked in red ink, and stacks of what looked like false identification documents. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin windows and making Jake acutely aware of how alone he was on this mountain. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the yellowed newspaper clipping pinned to the corkboard. The headline screamed in bold letters: Bank robber eludes FBI in daring escape. Below it, a grainy black and white photograph showed a man in a fedora and sunglasses, but something about the jawline, the way he held his shoulders, sent ice through Jake's veins. He unpinned the article and held it closer to the lantern's glow. The date read October 15th, 1987, 3 years before Jake was born. According to the article, the suspect had stolen over $200,000 from First National Bank of Denver and vanished without a trace. The FBI believed he was part of a larger criminal organization responsible for a string of robberies across the western United States. Jake's legs gave out and he sank onto the dusty wooden floor. This couldn't be real. Grandpa Joe was the man who taught him to fish, who made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, who never missed a single one of Jake's baseball games. He was gentle and kind and told terrible jokes that somehow always made Jake laugh anyway. But as Jake's eyes swept across the hidden room, the evidence mounted like an avalanche. Maps covered one wall, marked with red pins and handwritten notes in his grandfather's familiar scrawl. Dates, times, security schedules, all meticulously planned. A small safe sat open in the corner, revealing stacks of cash bound with rubber bands and what looked like several fake identification cards. Jake picked up one of the IDs with shaking fingers. The photograph was definitely his grandfather, but the name read Robert Chen. Another showed the same face with the name Michael Torres. How many identities had the old man created? A loose floorboard creaked behind him, and Jake spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. Just the old cabin settling, he told himself, but paranoia crept up his spine like spider legs. What if someone else knew about this room? What if they were watching him right now? He forced himself to continue exploring, though every instinct screamed at him to run. A leather journal sat on a makeshift desk constructed from sawhorses and plywood. Jake opened it with careful fingers, revealing pages of his grandfather's handwriting. The entries began in 1985. "The system is rigged against people like us," one entry read. "Banks steal from the poor every day with their fees and foreclosures. I'm just evening the score." Jake flipped through more pages, each one revealing another layer of deception. His grandfather had apparently started small, convenience stores and gas stations before graduating to banks. The journal detailed his methods, his philosophy, and most disturbingly, his complete lack of remorse. "Saw Jake today. Read an entry from just 2 years ago. He's growing up so fast. Martha made her famous apple pie. I pray he never learns what I've done. Some secret should die with the grave." Tears blurred Jake's vision. Even in his secret confessions, Grandpa Joe had thought about protecting him. But why keep all this evidence? Why not destroy it? Jake pocketed the key, his mind racing. Whatever his grandfather had hidden in that safety deposit box, it was important enough to require a backup plan. But it also meant more secrets, more evidence of crimes that could destroy not just his grandfather's memory, but Jake's entire family. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the hidden room. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and the sound seemed to carry a warning. Jake grabbed his backpack and climbed back through the opening, sealing the hidden room behind him. Now he was harboring evidence that could topple a criminal empire. Jake's hands trembled as he lifted the yellowed newspaper clipping from the box. The headline screamed at him in bold black letters: "Notorious bank robber the Ghost strikes again. FBI increases reward to $100,000. Below it, a grainy photograph showed a man in a fedora and dark coat walking away from a camera, his face obscured, but his build unmistakably familiar. The date read August 15th, 1987. Jake's grandfather would have been 32 then, the same age as the mysterious criminal the papers dubbed the Ghost for his ability to vanish without a trace after each heist. Jake sank onto the dusty floor, his legs suddenly unable to support him. This had to be some kind of mistake. His grandfather, Thomas Harrison, had been a quiet man who taught Sunday school and fixed neighbors' broken fences without being asked. The same man who'd patiently shown Jake how to whittle and told stories about rescuing injured birds couldn't possibly be the same person who'd terrorized banks across 3 states. But as Jake continued reading, the evidence mounted like storm clouds. The Ghost's signature move was cutting power to entire city blocks before striking, using the chaos to escape. He never hurt anyone, witnesses claimed, almost gentlemanly in his robberies. and he always left behind a small wooden carving, a calling card that drove the FBI to distraction. Jake's throat went dry. The shelves around him were lined with dozens of small wooden animals, each one carved with the same meticulous detail his grandfather had taught him. Owls, rabbits, deer, all staring down at him with tiny painted eyes that suddenly seemed accusatory. A manila envelope fell from between the newspaper pages, spilling photographs across the floor. Jake gathered them with shaking hands, his heart hammering against his ribs. The images showed his grandfather, definitely his grandfather, though younger and harder somehow, standing beside various cars, always different vehicles, always alone. In one photo, Thomas was counting stacks of money on a motel bed. In another, he wore a fake mustache and glasses, but those kind eyes were unmistakable. The final photograph made Jake's stomach lurch. His grandfather stood outside this very cabin, but it looked different, newer, with fresh lumber and recently installed windows. He was holding a shovel, dirt caked on his clothes, smiling at whoever held the camera. The back of the photo bore a date, October 1991, and 3 words in his grandfather's careful handwriting: "New life begins." Jake scrambled to his feet and grabbed the lantern, its beam dancing wildly as he searched the hidden room with new urgency. Behind another stack of boxes, he found a leather journal bound with string. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from its pages as Jake read the careful entries. April 3rd, 1987. Started watching the First National on Oak Street. Security changes shifts at 6 p.m. Power box located in alley behind building. June 12th, 1988. Close call today. FBI agent asked questions at the diner. Time to lay low. May need to consider retirement sooner than planned. March 20th, 1991. Final job complete. $2.8 million secured, enough to disappear forever and ensure family never wants for anything. Tomorrow I begin building my sanctuary. The entries continued, documenting his grandfather's transformation from criminal to hermit. He'd buried the money somewhere on the mountain property, keeping only enough to live simply. The rest remained hidden, waiting. A loose floorboard creaked above, and Jake froze. The sound came again, definitely footsteps moving through the main cabin. He quickly doused the lantern and held his breath, listening to the deliberate pace of someone searching, methodically through the rooms upstairs. Jake's mind raced. Who else knew about this place? His mother had insisted no one else had a key. The heavy footsteps paused directly overhead, then moved toward the kitchen where the hidden entrance lay concealed. Another board creaked, closer now, and Jake heard the unmistakable sound of the secret panel sliding open. Light spilled down the stairs, followed by the measured descent of someone who clearly knew exactly where they were going. "Hello, Jake. I think it's time we had a talk about your grandfather." Jake's hands trembled as he held the newspaper clipping up to the weak light filtering through the cabin's dusty windows. The black and white photograph stared back at him, unmistakably his grandfather's face, but younger, harder somehow. The headline read, "Notorious Bank Robber Mountain Ghost Strikes Again." The date showed 1987, when his grandfather would have been in his 30s. He sank onto the old wooden crate, his legs suddenly unable to support him. This had to be some kind of mistake. His grandfather, Samuel, had been a quiet man who taught Jake how to whittle, how to read animal tracks, how to find true north without a compass. The idea that this gentle soul could have robbed banks seemed as impossible as finding snow in July. But the evidence was spread across the hidden room, like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. Jake picked up another newspaper clipping, this one from 1989, "Mountain Ghost Eludes FBI Again After Daring Highway Robbery." The accompanying article described how the mysterious criminal had intercepted an armored truck carrying casino receipts, making off with nearly $200,000 without firing a single shot. A manila folder caught his attention, thick with documents that looked official. Jake opened it with the same dread he'd feel opening his report card after a particularly bad semester. Inside were detailed maps of various banks throughout Colorado and Wyoming, each marked with meticulous notes in his grandfather's familiar handwriting: security camera locations, guard rotations, escape routes. Everything was documented with the precision of a military operation. His breath caught when he found a leather journal buried beneath the maps. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and Jake recognized it immediately. His grandfather had always carried a small notebook, claiming he used it to track weather patterns and wildlife sightings during his hiking expeditions. Now Jake understood why Samuel had been so protective of it, never letting anyone else touch it. The first entry was dated June 15, 1985. The Mountaineer savings job went smoother than expected. 3 minutes in and out, no complications. The guard was cooperative once he understood I wasn't interested in hurting anyone. Took only what was needed, $34,000. Should be enough to last through winter. Jake flipped through page after page of similar entries, each one describing another robbery with the clinical detachment of someone recording grocery lists. But as he read deeper, he began to notice something strange. The amounts stolen were always relatively modest, and Samuel's notes repeatedly emphasized avoiding violence and taking only what was necessary. Another from 1990 used part of the Cedar Ridge score to anonymously pay for the Morrison family's medical bills, saw in the paper that their boy needed surgery they couldn't afford. The money will do more good there than sitting in some bank vault. Jake's mind reeled. This wasn't the profile of a hardened criminal, but it wasn't exactly Robin Hood either. He found a photograph tucked between the journal's pages, his grandfather standing next to a motorcycle, wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses. Even Jake had to admit Samuel looked like someone you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. A loose sheet of paper fell from the journal as he turned another page. It was a letter, written in his grandfather's hand but never sent, addressed to my family. Jake's throat tightened as he read, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found my secrets. I know this will be hard to understand, but everything I did was to protect the people I loved. After your grandmother died, I made choices that seemed right at the time but look different now. I never wanted this life to touch any of you, especially Jake. The boy deserves better than to carry the weight of my mistakes." The letter went on to explain how Samuel had started robbing banks after losing his job and facing overwhelming medical debt from his wife's cancer treatment. What began as desperation had somehow evolved into a strange kind of mission, targeting institutions he saw as corrupt while trying to help struggling families in his community. Jake set the letter down, his emotions churning like a storm-tossed lake. Part of him wanted to burn everything in the room and pretend he'd never found it. Another part felt a strange pride in his grandfather's misguided sense of justice. But mostly, he just felt lost. A sound from outside made him freeze, the distant rumble of an engine growing closer. Jake quickly stuffed the journal and letter into his backpack, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the grimy window, he could see a black SUV winding up the mountain road toward the cabin. Someone else knew about this place, and Jake had a sinking feeling they weren't here to pay their respects to his grandfather's memory. Jake's hands trembled as he spread the newspaper clippings across his grandfather's old wooden desk. The yellowed headlines screamed accusations that seemed impossible to reconcile with the gentle man who had taught him to fish and whittle. Notorious ART thief strikes again dominated one front page, while another proclaimed phantom burglar eludes FBI for third year. Each article contained the same sketch, a lean man with sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes that looked disturbingly familiar. Jake held up the faded photograph of his grandfather from his wallet, comparing it to the police composite. The resemblance was undeniable, even accounting for the artistic liberties of a sketch artist. His phone buzzed with a text from his mom. "How's the cabin cleanup going? Find anything interesting?" Jake stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could he possibly explain this? Instead, he typed back, "Just old furniture and papers. Slow going." The lie sat heavy in his stomach as he returned to the evidence spread before him. A leather-bound journal caught his attention, its pages filled with his grandfather's familiar handwriting. Jake opened it carefully, the the spine crackling with age. The first entry was dated 30 years ago. The Pemberton Museum was almost too easy. Security system outdated by at least a decade. The Monet is safely stored now, though I wonder if I'm doing this for the right reasons anymore. Jake's breath caught. His grandfather had actually written about stealing a Monet. He flipped through more pages, finding detailed accounts of heists across the country. Museums, private collections, art galleries, all described with the clinical precision of a man who had turned theft into an art form. But as Jake read deeper, something strange emerged from the entries. His grandfather hadn't been selling the stolen pieces. Instead, he wrote about preserving them and keeping them safe until the world is ready. Several entries mentioned returning pieces anonymously when museums improved their security or when political situations stabilized. Jake heard a car engine growing louder as it climbed the mountain road. He quickly gathered the papers, shoving them back into the hidden compartment as footsteps approached the front door. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Jake, you in there?" His father's voice carried through the wooden door. "Coming, Dad!" Jake slammed the secret panel shut and grabbed a random box of old books, positioning himself to look busy. He opened the door to find his father standing on the porch, holding 2 cups of coffee from the gas station down the mountain. "Thought you might need some fuel," his dad said, stepping inside and glancing around. "Making progress?" "Yeah, some." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, using the moment to study his father's face. Had Dad known? Was there any hint of awareness about his own father's double life? "Your grandfather sure was a pack rat," his father continued, picking up an old fishing magazine. "Though I suppose everyone gets sentimental about things as they age." The casual tone suggested innocence, but Jake noticed how his father's eyes swept the room methodically, as if searching for something specific. When his gaze lingered on the area near the hidden panel, Jake's suspicion deepened. "Find anything that might be worth keeping?" his father asked. "Just old books and magazines mostly, some fishing gear." Jake kept his voice steady, though his mind raced. "Nothing valuable." His father nodded, but something flickered across his expression. Disappointment? Relief? Jake couldn't tell. "Well, take your time going through everything. No rush." His father headed toward the door, then paused. "Jake, if you do find anything unusual, anything that doesn't make sense, you'll let me know, right? Your grandfather was complicated. Sometimes people we love have sides we never knew about." The words hung in the air like a warning. Jake managed a nod, not trusting his voice. After his father left, Jake waited until the car engine faded completely before returning to the hidden room. This time, he noticed something he had missed before, a small safe tucked behind the filing cabinet. The combination lock looked newer than everything else, as if it had been recently installed. 3 numbers were carved almost invisibly into the wood of the desk, his grandfather's fishing spot coordinates, Jake's birthday, and the year his grandfather had moved to the mountain. The safe clicked open on his second try, revealing a single manila envelope marked with his name in his grandfather's handwriting. The fluorescent bulb cast harsh shadows across the yellowed newspaper clippings as Jake spread them across the hidden room's floor. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged them chronologically, watching his grandfather's alleged crimes unfold like scenes from a movie he never wanted to see. "The Phantom Thief Strikes Again," read one headline from 1962. The accompanying photograph showed a jewelry store with its front window shattered, glass scattered across the sidewalk like fallen stars. The article described a sophisticated heist, no fingerprints, no witnesses, only empty display cases and a calling card, a small origami crane left behind at each scene. Jake's stomach churned as he remembered the paper cranes that had decorated his grandfather's cabin. He'd always thought they were just decorative, evidence of an old man's hobby. Now they seemed sinister, mocking reminders of a double life. Another clipping caught his attention. FBI manhunt intensifies for East Coast burglar. The date was October 1963, just months before his father was born. Jake tried to imagine his grandfather living this bizarre double existence, loving family man by day, master criminal by night. The cognitive dissonance made his head spin. His phone buzzed. A text from his mom. "How's the cabin cleanup going? Find anything interesting?" Jake stared at the message for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. "Everything. I've found everything, and it's destroying my world." Instead, he typed back, "Just old junk," taking longer than expected. The lies came easier now, which frightened him almost as much as the truth. He turned his attention to a manila folder marked contingency. Inside, he found what appeared to be escape plans. Multiple identities, safe house locations, emergency contact numbers. His grandfather had been prepared for anything. At the bottom of the folder was a letter addressed simply to family. Jake's hands shook as he unfolded the aged paper. The familiar handwriting made his chest tight with conflicting emotions. "If you're reading this, then you've discovered my secret. I know this must be devastating, and I'm sorrier than words can express. I never intended for any of you to carry this burden. The money hidden in this room was meant to be my confession and my penance. Every dollar I stole, plus interest, waiting to be returned. I spent 40 years planning to make things right, but cowardice and fear of losing your love kept me silent." Jake had to stop reading. His grandfather's voice seemed to echo in the cramped room, as real as if the old man were sitting beside him. He remembered fishing trips where his grandfather had seemed distant, staring across the lake with troubled eyes. Had he been wrestling with guilt even then? A sound from outside made Jake freeze. Footsteps on the porch above, slow and deliberate. He hadn't heard a car approach, which meant someone had walked up the mountain trail. His blood turned to ice as he remembered the shadowy figure from the previous day. The footsteps reached the basement floor and paused. Jake could hear someone moving around, examining the space. A flashlight beam swept across the gap under the hidden door, and Jake pressed himself further into the corner. "I know you're here, boy." The voice was gravelly, unfamiliar, with a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "Your grandfather and I, we had an understanding. Now that he's gone, that understanding transfers to you." Jake's mind raced. Who was this man? Another criminal from his grandfather's past? Someone seeking revenge? Or perhaps someone who knew about the money hidden in this room? The man's footsteps moved closer to the hidden door. "We need to talk about what Henry owed me. Debts don't die with the debtor." Jake's hand found the emergency exit latch. His grandfather's paranoia was about to save his life. The drive back to town felt like navigating through fog, even though the mountain roads were crystal clear. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and every few minutes he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror at the duffel bag sitting in his back seat like a ticking bomb. $3 million. The number kept cycling through his mind, refusing to settle into something that made sense. His grandfather, the man who had taught him to fish with homemade lures, who had worn the same flannel shirts for decades, who had driven a rusted pickup truck until the day he died, had been sitting on enough money to buy a mansion. Or maybe he hadn't been sitting on it at all. Maybe he'd been running from it. Jake pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, the same place where he eaten countless breakfasts with his grandfather during summer visits. The familiar red neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting an intermittent glow across the cracked asphalt. He needed to think, and he needed coffee, and Murphy's had always been a place where both seemed possible. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Dolores Murphy looked up from behind the counter with the same welcoming smile she'd worn for the past 20 years. But when her eyes met his, her expression shifted to concern. "Jake, honey, you look like you've seen a ghost. You feeling all right?" He slid into his usual booth, the one by the window where he and his grandfather had shared their last meal together just 2 months ago. "Just tired, Mrs. Murphy. Could I get some coffee?" She appeared at his table with a steaming mug before he'd finished the sentence, settling into the seat across from him with the practiced ease of someone who had been reading troubled faces for decades. "Your grandfather used to sit right there when something was weighing on him," she said softly. "Course, that wasn't often. Frank was usually the one doing the listening, not the talking." Jake wrapped his hands around the warm mug, using the heat to steady himself. "Mrs. Murphy, what do you remember about when my grandfather first came to town?" Her weathered face crinkled as she thought back. "Oh, that must have been, goodness, 35 years ago now? Maybe more. He just showed up one day, paid cash for that old cabin, and started keeping to himself mostly. Why do you ask? Did he ever mention where he came from? His past?" Dolores shook her head slowly. "Frank wasn't much for talking about yesterday, always said he was more interested in tomorrow. Though—" She paused, her fingers drumming against the worn Formica table. "There was something, about 10 years back, maybe 15. A man came through here asking questions about Frank, said he was some kind of researcher, writing a book about local history." Jake's coffee suddenly tasted like ash. "What kind of questions?" "Wanted to know when Frank had arrived, what he'd told people about his background. Had this intense way about him, like he was hunting for something specific. Frank happened to come in while the man was here, and I swear the temperature in this place dropped 20 degrees. They looked at each other like they were seeing ghosts." The diner seemed to spin slightly around Jake. "What happened then?" "Frank just walked over calm as you please, sat down right where you were sitting now, and started talking to the man real quiet-like. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but after about 10 minutes, the stranger got up and left. Never saw him again." "Did my grandfather say anything about it afterward?" Dolores stood up, smoothing down her apron. "Just asked me not to mention the conversation to anyone. Said some people had long memories and longer grudges, and it was better to let sleeping dogs lie." She studied Jake's face carefully. "He made me promise, actually. But I suppose with Frank gone now, and you being his family—" Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. Another piece of the puzzle, and it only made the picture darker. Someone had been looking for his grandfather, someone who had recognized him after all those years of hiding in plain sight. After Dolores returned to her kitchen duties, Jake sat alone with his thoughts and the weight of the duffel bag waiting in his car. Every revelation seemed to pull him deeper into a maze with no clear exit. His grandfather hadn't just been keeping secrets. He'd been actively hiding from something or someone. The smart thing would be to take the money to the police, tell them everything, and let the authorities sort it out. But the thought of watching his grandfather's reputation crumble, of seeing the man who had been his hero transformed into a villain in the eyes of everyone who had known and respected him, made Jake's stomach clench. As he left money on the table and headed for the door, one thought crystallized in his mind with disturbing clarity. Whoever had come looking for his grandfather 15 years ago might still be out there. And if they discovered that Frank Morrison's grandson had found what they'd been searching for, Jake might be next. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as Jake sat in his car outside the Millbrook Public Library, rain hammering against the windshield like angry fists. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to the night shift workers and late-studying college students. He'd been sitting here for 20 minutes, watching the entrance, trying to work up the courage to go inside. The manila envelope on the passenger seat seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Inside were photocopies of everything he'd found in the hidden room, the newspaper clippings, the photographs, the handwritten notes in his grandfather's familiar script. Jake had spent the last 3 days making copies, hiding the originals back in the cabin's secret compartment. He couldn't bring himself to destroy them, but he also couldn't keep carrying this burden alone. A flash of lightning illuminated the library's brick facade, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that made Jake jump. The storm was directly overhead now. He grabbed the envelope and sprinted through the rain to the library's entrance. The warmth inside was a relief, though it did nothing to calm the ice in his stomach. The main floor was quiet except for the soft clicking of keyboards and the occasional whisper. Jake made his way to the research section, where he'd reserved time on one of the computers with internet access. His fingers trembled slightly as he logged into the library's system and opened a web browser. For days he'd been avoiding this moment, the moment when he would search for his grandfather's name in connection with the crimes he'd discovered evidence of. Part of him still hoped it was all some elaborate misunderstanding, that there was an innocent explanation for everything. He typed Robert Novak 1987 armored car into the search bar and hit enter. The results that populated the screen made his heart sink. Article after article from newspapers across the country, all telling the same story. The Brinks armored car robbery in Cleveland that had netted nearly $2 million, 3 guards hospitalized, 1 suspect killed in the getaway, 2 others never caught. Jake clicked on the first article, dated October 15, 1987. The grainy photograph showed the aftermath of the robbery. An overturned armored truck, broken glass scattered across the asphalt, police cars with their lights flashing. But it was the sidebar that made his blood run cold, a composite sketch of one of the suspects based on eyewitness descriptions. The face staring back at him was unmistakably his grandfather's, though 30 years younger. The same deep-set eyes, the same strong jawline, the same scar above the left eyebrow that Grandpa Bob had always claimed came from falling off his bicycle as a child. Jake scrolled through more articles, each one adding another piece to the horrifying puzzle. The investigation had gone cold after 6 months. The FBI had suspected the remaining perpetrators had fled the country or assumed new identities. One article mentioned that the stolen money had never been recovered. His hands shook as he opened the envelope and pulled out one of the photographs he'd found in the cabin. It showed his grandfather standing next to a black sedan, the same make and model that witnesses had described as the getaway car. In the background, Jake could make out part of a street sign that matched the location mentioned in the police reports. A soft voice behind him made him jump. "Finding everything you need, honey?" Jake quickly minimized the browser window and spun around to find Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian who'd known him since childhood. Her kind eyes were filled with concern as she took in his pale face and nervous demeanor. She nodded, but her expression remained worried. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jake. Are you feeling all right? Maybe you should head home. This storm's getting pretty fierce." As if to emphasize her point, another thunderclap shook the building and the lights flickered momentarily. Jake glanced at the clock on the computer screen. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and the library would be closing soon. "Actually, that's probably a good idea," he said, quickly gathering up his papers and logging off the computer. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." The drive home through the storm felt surreal, like navigating through a nightmare. The windshield wipers could barely keep up with the rain, and Jake had to pull over twice when the visibility became too poor. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered. His grandfather, the man who'd taught him to fish, who'd helped him with homework, who'd never missed a birthday or Christmas, had been a violent criminal. The gentle hands that had shown him how to tie knots and identify birds had once held weapons during an armed robbery that had put innocent people in the hospital. By the time Jake reached home, the storm was beginning to subside, but the turmoil in his heart was just beginning. He sat in his driveway, engine running, staring at the dark windows of his house, where his parents were probably already asleep, blissfully unaware that their family's foundation had just crumbled beneath their son's feet. Jake's hands trembled as he picked up a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline screamed, "Ghost strikes again, priceless Van Gogh vanishes from Boston Museum." Below it, a grainy photo showed his grandfather, younger but unmistakably him, walking away from what the caption identified as the scene of the crime. Thunder crashed overhead, and Jake nearly jumped out of his skin. He'd been alone in the cabin for 3 days now, ever since discovering the hidden room behind the bookshelf. His parents thought he was at summer camp, giving him the perfect cover to investigate without interference. But the isolation was getting to him, and every shadow seemed to hide new secrets. A loose floorboard creaked behind him. Jake spun around, his heart racing, but found only empty air. The old cabin was full of such noises, he told himself, just the wood settling in the storm. He turned back to the evidence, forcing himself to focus. Among the photographs was something even more disturbing, a detailed map of the local area with several locations marked in red ink. Jake recognized some of them: the old mining tunnels, the abandoned ranger station, and most unsettling of all, the Hartwell estate where Mrs. Hartwell had been found dead just last month under mysterious circumstances. His phone buzzed with a text from his best friend Marcus. "Dude, camp counselors are asking where you are." I covered but running out of excuses. Jake typed back quickly, "Need a few more days, family emergency." It wasn't entirely a lie. This felt like the biggest emergency of his life. He pulled out a leather journal he'd found in the hidden room, his grandfather's handwriting filling page after page with what appeared to be meticulous planning notes. The entries went back decades, but the most recent ones made Jake's blood run cold. They were dated just weeks before his grandfather's death, and they mentioned the final job and protecting the boy. Jake's breath caught. The boy had to mean him. As he read deeper into the journal, a pattern emerged. His grandfather hadn't been stealing for money. He'd been recovering stolen artifacts and returning them to their rightful owners. The museum pieces, the artwork, even some historical documents mentioned in the entries, all appeared to have been stolen first by other criminals or acquired through questionable means. But why all the secrecy? Why let the world think he was a criminal? The answer came in an entry dated 6 months ago. "They're getting closer. The network knows I've been interfering with their operations. If something happens to me, Jake needs to stay clear of this. But if they come for him, he'll need to know the truth. The evidence is all here." Jake's phone rang, startling him so badly he knocked over his coffee mug. The caller ID showed his mother's number. "Hey, Mom," he answered, trying to sound casual while mopping up coffee with a dish towel. "Jake, honey, how's camp? You sound tired. Just been hiking a lot. You know how it is." He hated lying to her, but how could he explain any of this? "That's wonderful. Oh, I almost forgot. Someone came by the house asking about you yesterday. Said he was an old friend of your grandfather's. I gave him our address. I hope that's okay." Jake's blood turned to ice. What did he look like? Distinguished older gentleman, very polite. He said his name was, let me think, Vincent something. He seemed to know Henry quite well. Jake's eyes flew to the journal, scanning frantically until he found what he was looking for. There, Vincent Carrera mentioned multiple times as the network's enforcer and extremely dangerous. "Mom, listen to me carefully," Jake said, his voice barely steady. "Pack a bag and go stay with Aunt Linda for a few days. Don't ask questions, just do it. And whatever you do, if that man comes back, don't tell him where I am." Another creak echoed through the cabin, but this time it came from the front porch. Jake crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. Through the rain, he could make out a dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin. "I have to go, Mom. Please, just trust me and get somewhere safe." He hung up and quickly gathered the most important documents, stuffing them into his backpack. Whatever his grandfather had been involved in, it wasn't over, and now Jake was right in the middle of it. The beam of Jake's flashlight cut through the darkness as he descended into what appeared to be a natural cave system beneath the cabin. The wooden stairs his grandfather had built were solid despite their age, each step echoing in the confined space. Sarah followed close behind, her breathing quick and shallow in the musty air. "How far down does this go?" she whispered, though there was no one to overhear them. Jake paused on a landing, sweeping his light across rough stone walls. "I have no idea. Grandpa never mentioned any of this." His voice carried a bitter edge. The grandfather he thought he knew seemed to disappear a little more with each revelation. The stairs ended at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he turned the handle, half expecting it to be locked. It swung open with a low groan, revealing a space that made him catch his breath. The room was larger than the hidden chamber upstairs, carved directly from the mountain's bedrock. Battery-powered LED strips provided a pale, ghostly illumination, suggesting the space had been used recently. Along one wall stood several filing cabinets, their metal surfaces gleaming dully in the artificial light. A desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with maps, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. But it was the far wall that made Jake's blood run cold. Dozens of newspaper clippings were tacked to a corkboard, their headlines screaming of robberies, heists, and federal investigations. His grandfather's face stared back at him from several FBI wanted posters, some dating back over 30 years. "Jake," Sarah breathed, moving toward a glass display case in the corner. "You need to see this." Inside the case, arranged like museum pieces, were items that told the story of a criminal career spanning decades. Driver's licenses with different names but his grandfather's face, passports from 3 different countries, and in the center, a stack of bank deposit slips showing accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Monaco. The numbers made Jake dizzy. $23 million, Sarah read aloud. "Jake, your grandfather was rich, really rich." Jake slumped into the desk chair, overwhelmed. A leather-bound journal lay open in front of him, filled with his grandfather's familiar handwriting. The entries were dated, the most recent only 6 months before his death. FBI came close this time. "Agent Morrison is more persistent than I gave her credit for. May need to activate the contingency plan sooner than expected. Jake graduates next year. Should I tell him? The burden of this knowledge." "He was planning to tell me," Jake murmured, flipping through earlier pages. The journal chronicled years of careful planning, narrow escapes, and increasingly desperate attempts to cover his tracks. But threading through it all was a constant theme, protecting Jake and his family from the truth. Sarah had moved to the filing cabinets, pulling open drawers. "Jake, these files, they're not just about your grandfather. Look at this." She handed him a thick folder labeled Morrison Catherine, FBI. Inside were photographs, personal information, and detailed surveillance notes about the federal agent who had been hunting his grandfather for over a decade. Jake recognized the woman from some of the newspaper clippings. He was watching his pursuer, Jake said, pieces clicking into place, learning her patterns, staying one step ahead. "There's more." Sarah's voice was tight with worry. She held up another folder. "This one's labeled with your name." Jake's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were copies of his school records, medical files, even photographs taken from a distance of him walking to school, playing baseball, hanging out with friends. His grandfather had been watching him too, documenting his life from afar. A loose note fell from the folder, written in his grandfather's hand, "And Jake must never know while I'm alive. The danger to him would be too great. But if something happens to me, he deserves the truth. And the choice." "The choice?" Sarah asked, reading over his shoulder. Jake found the answer in another section of the journal. His grandfather had been preparing a final gift, or curse, detailed instructions for accessing the offshore accounts, along with new identities and escape routes, everything Jake would need to disappear if the past ever caught up with him. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs above made them both freeze. Heavy, deliberate steps that definitely weren't Jake's parents. "Did you lock the cabin door?" Sarah whispered. Jake's stomach dropped. In their excitement over the discovery, they'd rushed down to the cave without securing the entrance. Now someone was in the cabin above them, and they were trapped underground with nowhere to run. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, in what Jake knew was the main room. Then came the sound of furniture being moved, drawers being opened, the systematic search of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Agent Morrison had finally found them. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made Jake's blood freeze. He pressed himself against the basement wall, listening as car doors slammed shut outside. Through the narrow window, he could see the beam of flashlights cutting through the darkness. "They found us," Marcus whispered, his face pale in the dim light of the hidden room. Jake's mind raced. The evidence they'd discovered about his grandfather's past was spread across the table. Photographs, documents, and what appeared to be detailed records of crimes spanning decades. But now, with law enforcement closing in, none of that mattered as much as getting out alive. "There's got to be another way out," Jake said, frantically searching the walls of the secret room. His hands ran along the wooden panels, looking for anything that might indicate a hidden passage. Above them, heavy footsteps echoed through the cabin. Voices called out, professional and urgent. Jake could hear them systematically searching each room, getting closer to the basement entrance. "Jake, look at this," Marcus hissed, pointing to a section of the far wall where the wood grain seemed slightly different. Together they pushed against it, and to their amazement, a panel swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel carved into the mountain itself. "Grandpa really was paranoid," Jake muttered, grabbing the most important documents from the table. He couldn't leave everything behind, not when these papers might be the only way to understand the truth about his grandfather's double life. The tunnel was cramped and musty, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. Behind them, they could hear the agents discovering the hidden room, their shouts of excitement echoing through the passage. Jake's heart pounded as he pushed forward, following the beam of Marcus's phone flashlight. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the tunnel into a small cave opening on the mountainside, about a quarter-mile from the cabin. The night air hit Jake's face like a slap, cold and sharp with the scent of pine. Below them, he could see multiple vehicles surrounding the cabin, their lights creating an eerie glow in the forest. "We need to get to town," Marcus said, brushing dirt from his clothes. "My car's hidden in those trees down there, but we'll have to circle around to avoid the roadblocks they've probably set up." But the most disturbing discovery had been the newspaper clippings. Headlines about unsolved crimes, missing persons, bank heists that had baffled police for years. And in the margins of several articles, his grandfather had written notes in his familiar handwriting, corrections to the police theories, inside information that only someone involved could have known. "Jake," Marcus said softly as they reached the tree line near his car, "what are you going to do with all this information?" Jake looked down at the papers clutched in his hands. Part of him wanted to burn them all, to pretend none of this had ever happened. His grandfather had been his hero, the one person who'd always believed in him when everyone else saw only trouble. How could that same man have been living a lie for decades? But another part of him knew he couldn't just ignore the truth. If his grandfather really had been involved in serious crimes, there might be victims still waiting for justice, families who deserved answers. They reached Marcus's car, a beat-up sedan hidden behind a cluster of boulders. As Marcus started the engine, keeping the headlights off, Jake noticed something he'd missed before in the documents. One of the papers wasn't about a past crime. It was dated just 2 months ago, long after his grandfather's supposed death. "Marcus," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine. "I don't think my grandfather is dead." The car swerved slightly as Marcus processed this revelation. "What do you mean?" Jake showed him the document. "This account has been active since his funeral. He's alive, and he's been watching me this whole time." As they drove through the dark mountain roads, Jake realized that everything he thought he knew was wrong. His grandfather hadn't just been a criminal in the past. He was still out there somewhere, pulling strings, orchestrating events. And somehow, Jake was a crucial part of whatever game the old man was still playing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jake sat across from Detective Morrison in the sterile police station interview room. The manila folder between them seemed to pulse with dangerous secrets, and Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the water cup someone had placed in front of him. "The Phantom, they called him," Morrison continued. "Never hurt anyone, never used violence, but he was responsible for over $2 million in thefts across 7 states between 1987 and 2003. $2 million? Jake's voice cracked. But he lived so simply. He drove that old truck, wore the same 3 flannel shirts. That's what made him so good at disappearing. Most criminals can't resist the flashy lifestyle. Your grandfather understood that the best way to vanish was to become ordinary." Morrison pulled out another photograph, this one showing Ted with a woman Jake didn't recognize. He worked with a partner for most of his career, Rebecca Santos, also known as the Black Widow. She disappeared around the same time your grandfather went quiet. Jake studied the woman's face. She was beautiful, with dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. Something about her expression reminded him of someone, but he couldn't place it. "Where is she now?" That's what we'd like to know. Morrison leaned forward. Jake, I need you to understand something. We're not here to arrest you or cause trouble for your family. The statute of limitations has run out on most of your grandfather's crimes, and frankly, there are bigger fish to fry these days. But Rebecca Santos is a different story. What kind of something? Morrison hesitated. Your grandfather kept detailed records, plans, maps, contact information. If Rebecca is planning something big, she might need those records, or she might want to make sure they never surface. Are you saying I'm in danger? I'm saying you need to be very careful about who you trust. Morrison gathered the photographs back into the folder. Has anyone contacted you recently? Anyone asking questions about your grandfather or the cabin? Jake thought about Sarah, about how she had appeared so conveniently, how she seemed to know exactly what to say to gain his trust. The coincidence of meeting her at the diner, her eagerness to help him explore the cabin's secrets. His blood ran cold. There's a girl, he said slowly. Sarah. She's been helping me go through my grandfather's things. Morrison's expression sharpened. Describe her. About my age, dark hair, really smart. She knew a lot about antiques and old documents. Even as he spoke, Jake realized how foolish he had been. Sarah's knowledge hadn't been impressive, it had been suspiciously specific. The detective was already reaching for his phone. We need to get you into protective custody immediately. Wait, Jake grabbed Morrison's arm. She doesn't know about the hidden room. I never told her about the evidence we found. Are you certain? Jake replayed every conversation, every moment they had spent together. He had been so careful about the secret room, so paranoid about protecting his grandfather's memory. Ironically, his shame about the discovery might have saved his life. I'm sure. But she knows about the cabin, and she knows I've been going there alone. Morrison stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Then we don't have much time. If she is working with Rebecca Santos, they'll realize soon enough that you've found something worth hiding, and when they do, they'll come for you. The rain hammered against the windshield as Jake gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark plastic. Sarah sat beside him, clutching the manila envelope containing the copies they'd made of Grandpa's files. In the back seat, Detective Morrison rode in tense silence, occasionally glancing at his phone. Take the next exit, Morrison instructed, his voice cutting through the rhythmic drumming of rain. We're meeting Agent Chen at the field office downtown. Jake's stomach churned. 3 hours ago, he'd been just a kid dealing with family secrets. Now he was apparently instrumental in what Morrison called the biggest breakthrough in a 40-year-old case. The weight of it pressed down on him like the storm clouds overhead. You sure about this? Sarah whispered, her hand finding his arm. Once we hand these over, there's no going back. Jake nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The documents they'd discovered painted his grandfather as Thomas Caldwell, a man who'd allegedly embezzled millions from a bank in 1983 before vanishing without a trace. But the more Jake had studied the papers, the more questions arose. Why keep such detailed records? Why document every transaction, every contact, every move? It didn't fit the profile of a man trying to hide. The FBI field office loomed ahead, a concrete monument to justice that made Jake feel impossibly small. Morrison led them through security, past agents who eyed the teenagers with curious glances. The fluorescent lights felt harsh after days in the dim cabin, and Jake found himself missing the mountain's honest shadows. Agent Chen met them in Conference Room B, a sterile space dominated by a long table and harsh lighting. She was younger than Jake had expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that filled the room. Mr. Harrison, I understand you've uncovered some materials related to the Thomas Caldwell case. She gestured to chairs across from her. Detective Morrison has briefed me, but I'd like to hear your account directly. Jake recounted the discovery of the hidden room, the documents, the photographs. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When he finished, she studied him for a long moment. These are serious allegations, Jake. May I call you Jake? At his nod, she continued. What you found could reopen one of our oldest cold cases. But I need you to understand something. This investigation will scrutinize everything about your grandfather's life. Every relationship, every decision, every moment from 1983 forward. Are you prepared for that? The question hit harder than Jake expected. He thought of his grandmother, of family gatherings where Grandpa had taught him to whittle, of quiet fishing trips where the old man had shared stories of his youth. All of it would be dissected, analyzed, potentially destroyed. I need to know the truth, Jake said finally. Whatever it is. Chen nodded and opened the envelope. She spread the documents across the table, her expression growing more intrigued with each page. When she reached the photographs, she paused, studying them with renewed intensity. "This is remarkable," she murmured. "If authentic, these records are more detailed than anything we had from the original investigation. But Jake, I have to ask, did your grandfather ever mention anything about his past? Any inconsistencies in his stories?" Jake racked his memory. Grandpa had always been vague about his early adult years, claiming he'd knocked around a bit before settling down. But there had been moments, times when he'd seemed to catch himself before saying too much, or when his eyes would grow distant at certain questions. "He never talked much about before he married Grandma," Jake admitted. "Always said the past wasn't as important as what you did with your future." "Wise words," Chen said, but her tone suggested deeper meaning. She pulled out a tablet and scrolled through several files. "I'm going to show you something, but I need your word that this information doesn't leave this room." She turned the tablet toward them. The screen displayed a bank surveillance photo from 1983, grainy and distorted, but showing a man who might have been Grandpa 40 years younger. Beside it was an artist's reconstruction of what Thomas Caldwell might look like today. The resemblance was undeniable, yet something felt wrong. The man in this photo allegedly walked out of First National with $3.2 million, Chen explained. He had inside information, knew exactly which systems to bypass, which accounts to access. But here's what always bothered investigators. He took nothing for himself. Every dollar went to families who'd lost homes in foreclosures, to medical funds for sick children, to scholarships for disadvantaged students. It was the strangest bank robbery in FBI history. Jake stared at the photos, his understanding shifting. This wasn't just about discovering his grandfather was a criminal. This was about discovering he might have been something else entirely, a man who'd risked everything to help others when the system failed them. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, and Jake wondered if the storm was just beginning. The rain hammered against the cabin windows as Jake stared at the stack of documents spread across the kitchen table. 3 days had passed since his confrontation with Agent Morrison, and the weight of his grandfather's secrets felt heavier than ever. The cabin that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to press in around him, every shadow holding the ghost of his grandfather's hidden life. Sarah sat across from him, methodically sorting through bank statements and coded correspondence they'd found in a secondary hiding spot behind the fireplace. Her presence had become his anchor in the storm of revelations that threatened to pull him under. "Look at this," she said, holding up a faded photograph. "Your grandfather with a woman and a little girl. The woman looks like she could be your grandmother, but younger." Jake took the photo, studying the faces. His grandfather appeared relaxed, genuinely happy in a way Jake had rarely seen. The little girl, maybe 5 years old, had his grandfather's distinctive green eyes. "I've never seen this before," Jake murmured. "Grandpa never talked about my grandmother much, said it was too painful after she died." Sarah leaned closer, examining the back of the photograph. "There's writing here. It's faded, but I think it says Elena and Maria, 1987. The names meant nothing to Jake, but something about the photo stirred an uncomfortable recognition. He'd seen those eyes before, in another context entirely. A sudden knock at the door made them both freeze. Jake's heart hammered as he quickly gathered the documents, shoving them into the hidden compartment they'd discovered earlier. The knock came again, more insistent. "Jake? It's Sheriff Martinez. I need to talk to you." Relief and apprehension warred in Jake's chest. Sheriff Martinez had been kind to him since his arrival in town, but trust felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. He nodded to Sarah, who disappeared into the back room, then opened the door. Sheriff Martinez stood on the porch, rain dripping from his hat brim. His usual warm demeanor was replaced by something more serious, more cautious. "Evening, Jake. Mind if I come in? We need to discuss what happened the other day with Agent Morrison." Jake stepped aside, allowing the sheriff into the cabin. Martinez removed his hat, shaking off the water, and his eyes immediately began scanning the room. Jake noticed a careful way the sheriff positioned himself near the door, maintaining an exit route. "Agent Morrison filed a report," Martinez began, settling into the worn armchair. "Claims you assaulted a federal officer and interfered with an investigation. That's not what happened," Jake said quickly. "He broke into my cabin. He threatened me." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. When he looked up, there was something like sympathy in his eyes. "Your grandfather was a good man, Jake. Whatever Morrison told you, whatever evidence he thinks he has, I knew Richard Bennett. He helped this community more times than I can count. Fixed roofs for widows, paid medical bills for families who couldn't afford them, never asked for recognition. But that doesn't mean he wasn't also someone else," Jake said quietly. Martinez nodded slowly. "No, it doesn't. People are complicated, son. They can be heroes and criminals, saints and sinners, sometimes all at once." The sheriff stood, moving toward the window that overlooked the valley. "What I can tell you is that Morrison isn't the only one interested in your grandfather's past. There are others, people who might not be as patient as a federal agent, people who might not care that you're just a kid caught in the middle." Ice formed in Jake's stomach. "What kind of people?" "The kind your grandfather spent his last years hiding from." Martinez turned back to face him. "Jake, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Have you found anything in this cabin that might explain why these people are so interested in your grandfather?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake thought about the hidden room, the evidence of crimes spanning decades, the money, the documents. He thought about Sarah, hidden in the back room, and Agent Morrison's threats. Most of all, he thought about the photograph of his grandfather with the woman and child, and the nagging feeling that it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Sheriff," Jake said finally, "if I had found something that could hurt people or put them in danger, what would you advise me to do?" Martinez studied him for a long moment, then walked to the door. "I'd advise you to trust very carefully, Jake, and to remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all." After the sheriff left, Jake stood at the window watching his taillights disappear into the storm, wondering if he'd just made his first ally or his most dangerous enemy. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the mountain silence like a blade. Jake pressed himself against the window frame, watching as 3 black SUVs wound their way up the narrow access road, their headlights sweeping across the pine trees in the growing dusk. His heart hammered against his ribs as he counted at least a dozen figures emerging from the vehicles, their movements coordinated and purposeful. "They found us," Sarah whispered from behind him, her voice barely audible. They rushed through the cabin's main room, Morrison clutching the most crucial evidence, while Sarah grabbed Jake's grandfather's journal, the one document that might explain everything. Jake's hands shook as he pulled up the loose floorboards near the stone fireplace, revealing the narrow wooden ladder that led down into darkness. "Where does it lead?" Morrison demanded, already lowering himself into the opening. "About 50 yards into the tree line. Grandpa said it was built during Prohibition." Jake's voice cracked slightly. Even now, in the midst of their escape, he couldn't reconcile the man who'd built secret tunnels with the one who'd patiently taught him to whittle wood figures. Sarah dropped down next, and Jake followed, pulling the boards back into place just as he heard the cabin's front door splinter. Their footsteps echoed off stone walls as they felt their way through the tunnel, Morrison's phone providing the only light. The passage smelled of damp earth and decades of disuse, but it was solid, another testament to his grandfather's meticulous planning. They emerged behind a cluster of boulders just as flashlight beams began sweeping the cabin's interior. Jake could hear voices shouting commands, the systematic destruction of furniture as the intruders searched for what they'd already taken. "My truck's parked about a quarter-mile down the old logging road," Morrison whispered. "But we need to move carefully. They'll have posted lookouts." As they crept through the underbrush, Jake caught fragments of conversation from the cabin. The men weren't law enforcement. Their language was too rough, their methods too destructive. These were Volkov's people, and they were angry about something missing. "The Castellano job," Sarah breathed, pointing to a passage in the journal she'd been reading by moonlight. "Your grandfather didn't just forge documents for it. He kept records, names, dates, bank account numbers. This is evidence of a murder that was never solved." Jake's stomach lurched. A murder. His grandfather hadn't just been a forger, he'd been connected to something far darker. The romantic notion of a gentleman criminal evaporated entirely, replaced by the horrible understanding that Thomas Chen's secrets went deeper than anyone had imagined. They reached Morrison's truck without incident, but as the engine turned over, headlights blazed to life behind them. One of the SUVs had been waiting, and now it was giving chase as Morrison gunned the engine down the treacherous mountain road. "They're not going to let us reach the highway," Morrison said grimly, taking a curve too fast. The truck's tires screamed against asphalt as they rounded another bend. Jake gripped the dashboard, watching the pursuing headlights grow larger in the side mirror. Everything his grandfather had built, his reputation, his relationships, his carefully constructed identity, was based on lies. And now those lies were about to get them all killed. "There," Sarah pointed ahead to where the road split. "The ranger station. If we can make it there." The rear window exploded inward as their pursuers opened fire. Morrison yanked the wheel hard left, sending them careening toward what Jake desperately hoped would be salvation, carrying evidence that would either clear his grandfather's name or damn his memory forever. The sheriff's cruiser wound up the narrow mountain road, its headlights cutting through the early morning mist. Jake sat in the passenger seat, his stomach churning with each hairpin turn. Behind them, Detective Morrison followed in an unmarked sedan, and Jake could see the federal agent's black SUV bringing up the rear through the side mirror. "You sure about this, son?" Sheriff Hawkins asked for the third time, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Jake nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. The manila envelope containing copies of all the evidence sat heavy on his lap. Original documents, photographs, his grandfather's detailed confession, everything that would finally close a case that had haunted the FBI for over 30 years. The cabin came into view as they rounded the final bend. It looked different in the pale dawn light, smaller somehow, as if the weight of its secrets had diminished it. Jake's parents' car was already there, parked beside the porch where he'd first found that loose floorboard just 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks that felt like a lifetime. His mother emerged from the cabin as the convoy pulled up, her face drawn with exhaustion. She'd aged years in the past few days since Jake had told them everything. His father appeared behind her, carrying a cardboard box, more of his grandfather's belongings, Jake realized. "The federal agents want to see the room," Detective Morrison said as she approached. Agent Chen and Agent Rodriguez flanked her, their expressions professionally neutral. They need to process the scene themselves. Jake led them inside, past the familiar living room where he'd spent countless hours listening to his grandfather's stories. How many of those tales had been carefully crafted lies? How many contained kernels of truth about a life Jake never could have imagined? The hidden door stood open now, no longer concealing its secrets. Agent Chen stepped inside first, her flashlight beam sweeping across the walls, lined with newspaper clippings, surveillance photos, and meticulously organized files. The evidence of Arthur Brennan's double life was overwhelming, decades of planning and executing some of the most sophisticated heists in American history. "Remarkable," Agent Rodriguez murmured, examining the detailed floor plans of the First National Bank of Denver. "We always suspected the 1987 job was an inside operation, but we never imagined it was this elaborate." Jake's mother appeared beside him, her hand finding his shoulder. "Your grandfather loved you," she said quietly. "Whatever else he was, whatever he did, that was real." But Jake wasn't sure what was real anymore. The grandfather who taught him to fish, who helped with homework, who always had time for a game of chess. Had that man existed at all? Or was Arthur Brennan just another carefully constructed identity? Like the dozens of fake passports and driver's licenses Agent Chen was now cataloguing. "There's something else," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The agents looked up from their work. "In the desk drawer. I didn't include it in the copies I gave you." He moved to the small wooden desk and pulled out the bottom drawer completely, revealing the hidden compartment underneath. Inside was a single letter, addressed in his grandfather's familiar handwriting for Jake. With trembling fingers, Jake opened the envelope. The letter was short, written in the same careful script that had filled the confession. "My dear Jake," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've discovered the truth about your old grandfather. I know you must hate me now, and I wouldn't blame you if you do, but I need you to know that every moment we spent together was precious to me. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, the chance to be a good man, even if only in small ways. The money from the jobs is gone, donated anonymously to charities over the years. I kept detailed records. They're in the blue folder. I couldn't undo what I'd done, but I could try to make it mean something. The FBI will want those records. You have a good heart, Jake. Don't let my sins burden it. Live the honest life I should have lived. And remember, if you can, that the man who taught you to cast a fishing line and loved you like his own soul, that man was real too. Your grandfather always, Arthur." Jake's hands shook as he finished reading. Agent Chen was saying something about the blue folder, about restitution and closure for victims' families, but the words seemed to come from very far away. "Jake," his mother's voice brought him back. "Are you all right?" He looked around the hidden room one more time, at the evidence of crimes and the careful records of redemption, at the life his grandfather had built on lies and the love that had somehow grown from it anyway. "I think so," he said finally. "I think I'm going to be." The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin porch as Jake sat with the final manila envelope in his hands. For 2 weeks, he'd methodically worked through every piece of evidence, every photograph, every document that painted his grandfather as someone he'd never known. But this last envelope felt different, heavier somehow, though it weighed no more than the others. Inside, he found a letter addressed to him in his grandfather's familiar handwriting, dated just 3 months before the old man's death. Jake's hands trembled as he unfolded the pages. "My dear Jake, you're reading this. Then you've found my secret room and learned the truth about your grandfather. I imagine you're angry, confused, maybe even disgusted. You have every right to be. But please, read this through to the end before you decide what kind of man I really was." Jake paused, his heart hammering. He'd found records of the robberies, the manhunt, even some of the stolen cash hidden behind false walls. But his grandfather was right. The why had remained a mystery. "In 1967, your grandmother was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder. The treatments weren't covered by insurance, and I was making $12 a week at the lumber mill. The doctors said without treatment, she had maybe 6 months. With it, she could live a normal life. The cost? More money than I'd see in 10 lifetimes. Tried everything legal first. Loans, second jobs, selling everything we owned. Nothing came close. So I made a choice that haunts me to this day. I decided to become someone else, someone who could get that money by any means necessary." Jake's throat tightened. His grandmother had lived until he was 10, dying peacefully in her sleep. He'd never known she'd been sick when she was young. "Never hurt anyone, Jake. I chose small-town banks, went in alone, used an empty gun, and always hit places where I knew the money was insured. I told myself that made it less wrong, but a crime is a crime. I stole, and I became very good at it. The money paid for your grandmother's treatment and bought us time to disappear. We moved here, to the mountains, where I buried Tommy Morrison forever and became the grandfather you knew, the man who taught you to fish, who helped with your homework, who loved you more than his own life. But I need you to know about the rest of the money, Jake. Most of it, nearly all of it, I gave away, anonymously. Families who'd lost their homes, kids who needed medical care, elderly folks about to lose their farms. I kept records of every dollar I returned to the world in my own way. You'll find those records in the blue folder. Jake frantically searched through the papers until he found it. Page after page of careful documentation, anonymous donations, mysterious benefactors helping families in need, charitable contributions that had changed lives. The amounts totaled far more than what had been stolen from the banks. I know this doesn't make what I did right. I know you might never forgive me for lying to you, for letting you love a man who didn't really exist. But I need you to understand that every day I was your grandfather, every moment we shared, that was real. That was the man I chose to become after my crimes were over. Now you have a choice to make. In the red folder you'll find contact information for the FBI agent who handled my case. He's retired now, but he'd remember. You could turn in all this evidence, and maybe some families would get closure. I'd understand. You could do what I hope you'll do. Take the remaining money and the deed to this land. Sell it all, and continue the work I started. There are still people who need help, Jake. Still families facing impossible choices. You could be the answer to their prayers, just like I'd tried to be. Whatever you decide, know that you were the greatest joy of my life. You made me remember what it felt like to be good, to be worthy of love. In your eyes, I wasn't a criminal. I was just Grandpa. For that gift, I'll be grateful for eternity. And I love you, son. I hope someday you can forgive a foolish old man who loved his family more than he feared the consequences. And your grandfather always, William Henderson. Jake sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. The letter had changed everything and nothing. The facts remained the same, but now he understood the heart behind them. Finally, he stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the valley his grandfather had called home for 5 decades. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from his father, asking when he'd be heading home. Jake smiled, typing back a simple message, "Soon, but I have some work to finish here first." He had a decision to make, and he already knew what his grandfather would want him to choose.